Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Business Law 1. Today we're going to be briefly looking at Chapter 18, which involves title and risk of loss. So some of the primary learning objectives that I want us to kind of take away from this chapter is to understand why understanding title is important and at what point in the contracting relationship does the buyer actually acquire title. Title can be either constructive or actual, which we'll kind of go into a little more detail in a few minutes. Actual is where you physically are in possession of the goods. So that would be, title is yours because you have them literally. Constructive would be that maybe it's been shipped, but it hasn't been received yet, but technically it does belong to you as the buyer as soon as it has left the control of the seller. Another learning objective is to understand why risk of loss is important. Understanding when title transfers is essential to understanding risk of loss. Me as a buyer of goods, unless I have an insurable interest or I have like constructive or actual possession of the goods, I don't really have a stake in the game to claim a risk of loss should a loss occur, whether the goods are damaged or destroyed in transit. And then the last kind of learning objective is to understand under what circumstances the buyer can obtain title when a non-owner sells the goods. So those are the overall things that we're looking at in this chapter. Some potential issues that come up when we're talking about goods. There could be damage to goods, and if so, then it's like, well, who is going to bear the loss or the cost associated with the damage of those goods? Are we going to try and go after the shipper, the company that is transporting the goods, because that might be a form of remedy? Is it going to be a responsibility of the seller, or is it going to be a responsibility of the buyer to absorb that loss or that cost? So we'll look at some shipping terms, and that'll kind of help navigate and figure out who's going to be bearing responsibility in these unique situations. Another situation that can come up involves creditor claims. And so it could be the Internal Revenue Service, it could be some creditor of the seller. If they go through the judicial process of getting, let's say, some sort of judgment or lien against property owned by the seller, they can actually show up and start seizing physical goods then with that judicial order. And what if I run, let's say a manufacturing facility, and I have in my warehouse, $1 million of inventory, and I have an order for $100,000 that has just been processed, and so maybe it's on the loading bay dock, ready to be put on a truck to ship to the buyer. And let's say the IRS shows up, and they're like, well, we have this judicial order, we're seizing all the inventory in this warehouse to satisfy a tax lien judgment. It's like, if I'm the buyer, I'm not going to be happy because maybe I already wired payment to the seller and I'm thinking I have title to these goods now, when in reality they've been seized by the IRS or this creditor. And so we'll kind of discuss that a little bit as we go through this chapter. To have an insurable interest, you've got to have some sort of identified stake in the property in question. So, until goods have been, identified and it's either actual or constructive title has transferred, there really is no basis for an insurable interest yet. There has to be some sort of stake at risk in order for someone to claim that they have an insurable interest. Usually insurance companies won't let you get insurance unless you can demonstrate you have that kind of like stake. Or if you do get the insurance, they just won't pay out on it because they'll do their due diligence before they render a payment for a claim. So you have to be very careful how you deal with that. When we're trying to look at different types of goods, remember, identification is the point where the buyer acquires title and an interest in the goods, and it can be constructive or actual. So it can be in shipment mode, which is constructive, or it can be actual, meaning that it's been delivered or picked up by the buyer. Existing goods are goods that they're already made, and so they're sitting on a shelf waiting to be purchased or sold. Future goods, by its very label, will be existing goods one day, but they don't exist yet. So maybe they're special order. So, if I have a business and I contact a manufacturer and say, oh, I need you to make 100,000 parts for, this component that I'm making, as soon as they're made, they will be existing goods. And then as soon as they're shipped or identified, then I have an insurable interest in those goods. But until they've been made yet, they're just considered generic future goods. Fungible goods are just indistinguishable goods. So if I'm, let's say Ace Hardware, if I'm Lowe's, if I'm Home Depot, and I order a shipment of, let's say, concrete blocks, if they're all the same size, color, and material, they're all fungible. I could have one from a year ago and one from today. It doesn't matter. They look the same. They'll last the same. Fungible goods can also be perishable, though. Maybe I'm a grocery store and, I sell, let's say, organic milk. Organic milk can be like fat-free, 1%, 2%. And so all of that same type of category is going to be fungible, if it's organic, non-fat milk, even though it is perishable. Remember, insurable interest is contingent upon identification. Identification is where the buyer acquires an interest in the goods, actual or constructive. Remember that. So when we talk about, these types of goods, most goods don't have a document of title. So if I order, if I'm a grocery store and I order, 1,000 gallons of organic fat-free milk, there's not a physical title to those goods. Because they don't have serial numbers. You don't track them like that per se. But a document of title could be in one of two forms. It could be by the bill of lading, so that's the shipping documentation for how that has been, how those gallons of milk are being transported. It can also be the evidence through what's called a warehouse receipt. So maybe it's being stored temporarily in a warehouse, and so as soon as I buy it, I'm acquiring the ownership stake, that identification in those goods. Warehouse receipts can be negotiable or non-negotiable. Negotiable means that anybody who is the bearer to that receipt can claim those goods. If it's non-negotiable, you have to be the named party to that receipt in order to pick up the goods that have been stored in that commercial warehouse. Some shipping terms, I won't read all of these, but I'll just kind of highlight some of the important ones. You might see in terms of a shipping contract, it might say FOB, place of shipment, and that's where the seller is obligated to deliver the goods to a carrier. It could be the post office, it could be FedEx, it could be a cargo ship. And then at that point, the seller is no longer responsible. So if you're dealing with, let's say, a Chinese company, and if it's FOB, place of shipment, if they get it to the docks and it's loaded onto a ship and it goes out to sea, then they're no longer responsible. It can arrive to you intact. The ship could sink in transit. It doesn't matter. They get paid no matter what. FOB, place of destination, the seller is responsible to get the goods to the buyer. And so the seller remains accountable during the entire shipment. So here, the seller is probably going to charge more for this type of transaction because they know that they're not fully releasing the goods to the buyer until delivery has been made. So up until that point, things could get damaged. There could be shrinkage, meaning things could be stolen. They could be destroyed. So many different things happen it only exponentially grows the risk the farther goods are being transported around our planet. FAS is free along ship, and so that's equivalent to the FOB shipments. The common thing nowadays is to have CIF, which is considered cost, freight, and insurance. And so insurance is acquired by the seller, and goods are delivered to whoever the carrier is. And if there is a problem in shipment, damage, shrinkage, destruction, then the buyer is the designated beneficiary of the insurance policy, and then they just deal with the insurance carrier. It increases the cost of the transaction depending on what we're talking about, either moderately or potentially more. But at least from the seller's perspective and the buyer's perspective, it does provide peace of mind. You don't have to even worry about it then. If something happens, you got insurance. You're covered at that point. That seems to be a preferred form in terms of a contractual requirement. So In terms of passage of title and shipment contracts, so as I mentioned, the FOB place of shipment, as soon as a title, passes, it's the result of the seller, placing the goods with the carrier, title transfers to the buyer at that point. Even though actual delivery has not occurred yet, constructive ownership transfers. If it's a FOB place of destination, remember the title passes when the seller gets the goods to the buyer and they are considered what are called tendered. Tender is a legal term of art that means three things. The goods have arrived, they are available for pickup, and the buyer has been notified. So let's say that I'm buying some produce, and it's the company I'm dealing with is out of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And so, let's say it's left port in South America and it's headed to, let's say, the port of Miami. So, obviously with GPS, global tracking, buyer and seller knows where the ship is at any given point, within a few hundred feet, in terms of where it is at sea. Let's say the ship makes it to the port of Miami, and so it's arrived. It is tethered to the docks at the port of Miami. Okay, we've satisfied phase one of tendering. Just because something is at the port, it doesn't mean that it's ready for pickup, though. You've got to get through customs. You have to clear the goods that are being shipped. So until customs clears it, it's not available for pickup. And, so notification to the buyer, you might notify them that, okay, yeah, they've arrived, and we'll send you a follow-up notification once they're available for pickup. That's up to whatever the seller wants to do or the carrier. But as soon as it's offloaded and customs has cleared it, then you can truly say the goods have arrived, they are available for pickup, and then that's when the buyer does need to be notified. And upon the completion of those three elements, tender has occurred, title has officially passed. So the seller is done at that point. If while it's sitting on the docks, things spoil, things shrink, things disappear, things are destroyed, things are damaged, whatever, it's on the buyer then. And hopefully they have insurance for any type of situation that might occur like that. If we're talking about risk of loss between not merchants, the general rule is that risk of loss passes from the seller to the buyer upon tender of the goods. And so tender of the good, an example there might be a garage sale transaction. As soon as you buy it, it is yours at that point. And even if you say hold on to it, you've got to be very careful because that risk of loss has transferred as soon as you pay for it. So the overall, the key thing to remember when we're talking about risk of loss with non-merchants is that they have a greater potential for risk there. As soon as the goods are tendered, meaning they're available, the buyer's been notified, and you can pick them up, then that risk of loss occurs at that point. Just a couple of final things as we kind of wind down this chapter. When we talk about the carrier, so let's say it's the shipping company is separate from the buyer or seller, so they're not associated. They're not like, you don't have like in-house shipping, kind of like carrier, but it's like FedEx, UPS, whatever it is, post office. The general standard is that a common carrier is absolutely liable for loss or damage to goods. So that's a fairly wide net that's being cast over these shipping companies. But as you can see with the list of exceptions, the common elements that all these exceptions have are that there are unforeseeable things that occur that are out of the control of the shipping company. So act of God or act of nature, depending on the author of the textbook, I've heard people label it different ways, but, think of tornadoes, think of, hurricanes, think of, lightning strikes, whatever we're discussing, something that's an act of nature. An act of a public enemy, fortunately, we don't really have a lot of instances where that occurs. But think of like 9/11, that was definitely a public enemy, a terror act. And, you can only imagine the number of contracts that were disrupted or terminated because of what occurred. And so, if we're talking about things that were in the process of being shipped, then, that's obviously going to be an exception for that shipper or carrier. They don't have to absorb that loss in that situation. Act of public authority, another 9/11 example, if for those of you old enough to remember this, for a little over a week after the terror attacks, ports around the United States were closed, as well as airports. And, imagine, you use that example of, like, let's say produce was coming into the port of Miami from South America. If it was, if you had the bad luck of just docking and then, like, the port gets shut down, all that's food just spoiled. And again, if you're the actual cargo ship, normally if food spoils in your ship because, like, let's say that you didn't refrigerate it properly or whatever happened, that would be a loss on you as the shipping company. But because the port was actually shut down as an act of the U.S. national government, then you're not responsible for that loss. So hopefully there's insurance or there's some other coverage for the buyer and the seller so that they're insulated from the loss because of that act of public authority. So again, just to kind of understand the general kind of liability there. The last slide here involves unique situations where the seller is not necessarily the owner of the goods. And so, this can happen in two main situations. You can have like a consignment or a factorage transaction. So maybe it's like a resale shop, or if it's an auction sale environment. And normally what happens is, if it's a consignment store or an auction house, title just passes through that seller. So whoever the original owner is and whoever the buyer is who will become the owner, that title transfers it just passes through whoever that intermediary is, so that it is a completed transaction as soon as the sale is taken care of. Self-service situations, technically no title transfers until payment is made by the buyer. So, to give you an example, and this has implication for risk of loss. So let's say, I'm walking through, I'm trying to think of a store. I guess let's say, Walmart. And let's say they have some lamps on display there. And so, I'm walking through the store. I'm trying to decide, what kind of lamp I want to buy. And let's say that, the displays that are there, I knock over a lamp and it breaks. And so, let's say it's made out of glass or something. And so it just breaks, it's destroyed. The risk of loss is on Walmart at that point. It's not on me because it was just an accident. If I was intentionally, knocking over stuff and destroying it, that's a different story because that's a crime then. But if it's just an accident, I'm not responsible. It's part of doing business. Hopefully they have insurance, premises insurance to cover those types of events. So, I've seen in stores, signs put up that says you break, you buy. And, there's really no way to legally enforce that, under this general standard of self-service, under, these special situations. But I mean, stores can say that. It may not necessarily mean that they have the right to actually impose that on a customer. If my general advice has always been, if you are the type of seller and you're dealing with very fragile type goods, maybe you make glass figurines, or, something that's very delicate, have it in a showcase, have it behind a counter, and as customers want to interact or look at it before a purchase, assist them. And say, okay, let me help get this out of the showcase so you can take a closer look at it. That would be the most appropriate thing to do. But to, say, oh, you bumped into something and you knocked it over and it broke, well, now you owe this, you got to buy this. Normally, that's not something that could be expected, change the facts a little bit. Let's say I buy that lamp at Walmart, and as I'm walking out to the parking lot, I drop it in the parking lot and it drops and it breaks. That's on me then, that risk of loss, because I now own that property. So, again, hopefully this chapter has given you a greater appreciation for kind of understanding the significance of title and how that impacts the risk of loss, because that's really what all this chapter is about, is kind of understanding that connection that exists. And if you're involved in any type of shipment process, that can further kind of complicate it, because you're trying to break down, well, okay, who has ownership, constructive, actual, is there an insurable interest, was there insurance secured for this transaction? And that's really the big things that we're trying to get out of this chapter. So anyway, I hope we have a greater appreciation for understanding this now. As you have questions, if you want to email, call, or text me, whatever is easier, be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. But have a good, safe, and productive rest of the week, and I'll be chatting with you all online. Thank you.